Chairman Hagoel, Minister Tamano Shata, Minister Elkin, Major Leckett, Brigadier General Cohen, Ms. Dahan, Mr. Kukierman, Mr. Litwack, invited guests, friends, and community members, on behalf of our synagogue president, Jeffrey Jacob, and our Chazan, Malachi Kanfer, our board member and Sar El volunteer, Michael Ripka, Bruchim Habaim, welcome. I am the rabbi here at Sutton Place Synagogue, and it is an honor to have all of you in our sanctuary.
I'm honored to invite volunteer Ilana Blumenthal to say a few words. Here.
I'm not too short. That's great. Shalom lekulam. My name is Ilana, and I come from a long line of labor Zionists, including those who worked toward the establishment of the modern state of Israel. My family's made Aliyah several times in various iterations since the early 1950s, when my grandfather taught physics at the Technion. My grandmother lived in Israel for 20 years. My mother lived there multiple times throughout her youth, and I made Aliyah with my parents when I was a young child. While we had no other choice but to make Yeridah, we continued to return as often as finances would allow. My relatives and friendships there span generations. I attended Jewish day school, worked for years in a Jewish museum, and currently work for Israeli organizations. I've attended several rallies to stand up for Israel, one where I was the only pro-Israel voice against a huge crowd of Jewish Voices for Peace, screaming that the IDF was not a moral army. I tell you all of this because I perfectly fit the profile of a person you would expect to volunteer her time with Sar El, to fly to Israel and pack medical backpacks or ready emergency equipment for the Air Force, to be vocal when defending Israel to her non-Jewish and, unfortunately, to her Jewish peers, who for some reason feel little to no connection to Israel, and in fact feel that speaking out against it is the politically correct thing to do. Today, people base their views on our homeland and the daily threat that our brothers and sisters are facing there, on incorrect news broadcasts, slanted headlines, and anti-Semitic politicians' statements. When I present the facts, they're thrown back in my face with a comment that I'm biased and that I get my facts from Israeli news sources only. I see this as a crisis that I know that Sar El plays a part in combating. Just before the pandemic shook our world, I worked on Palmachim with a group of passionate volunteers, some of whom are here today. Some fit the profile like I did, but many didn't. Christians from the South, those who had never met a Jew or had a Jewish friend, those who had never been to Israel, had no family there, and those who had never experienced anti-Semitism. Despite all of this, their passion and support for the country was clear, and they worked as hard as I did on that base. They, however, had no firsthand knowledge, and that was about to change. One evening after we began dispersing from our lesson, we heard the following announcement over the loudspeakers. Emet, 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 tseva adom, b'kol ha'ezorim. As we ran through the dark to the shelter, there were shouts of confusion, volunteers asking where their friends were, and in haste, one or two people lost their footing. What I want you to know is that at that moment, as I watched the missiles flying through the air from Gaza, I wasn't scared. I was proud. I could now speak as someone who had to run. I was also thankful, as now, so could my fellow volunteers. As we sat in the bunker, I calmed down some of my new friends, but also explained to them that we were the lucky ones. We weren't protecting our children or our parents with only seconds to find a shelter. It was only our temporary home that was being targeted, not the homes where we spend our lives. Others are not as lucky. This is life in Israel. This is the message we need to spread when we get home. We need to tell this story. We left the bunker when our madrichot said it was safe. A few days later, I taught some of the volunteers new to Israel and Judaism Hatikva, so that the next time we stood at attention the morning flag raising, they could take part in a more meaningful way. Sure, Sar El is not only letting me fulfill one of my dreams, since I never got to serve because we made Yerida, but perhaps more importantly, it serves the role of creating ardent Zionists, no matter what their backgrounds, with firsthand knowledge of the dangers Israel's facing, the kindness of the Israeli people, and the passion and drive of the soldiers. It gives these individuals the facts they need to go back and speak on our behalf, to tell the truth no matter what the news is saying. Sar El creates pro-Israel voices. The volunteers saw the missiles. They knew they were unprovoked. They ran to the bomb shelter with me, and they had a sleepless night. They can now say, I was there. I know. I saw. I felt. I was born the year Sar El started, and the date of my birth, the 26th of May, is the anniversary of the birth of the IDF. VFI and Sar El teach those who don't fit the profile that I do. Thank you.
I'm honored to invite volunteer Steve Litwack to say a few words.
Good afternoon to all the Sar El dignitaries, guests, and fellow volunteers. Sar El at 40 years, what a great accomplishment. So where were you 40 years ago? I can answer that. I made Aliyah to Israel, was living on kibbutz Neve Or. My original job on the kibbutz was working in the cotton fields. So I was working the land, I was speaking Hebrew, and living in Israel, I was living according to the Jewish calendar. Shabbat was Shabbat, and holidays were Jewish holidays. So I was living the Zionist dream. Like most Israelis, if you live in the country long enough, you have to serve in the Israeli army. In 1980, at age 26, I was drafted into the Israeli army as a lone soldier, a Chayal Boded, one who has no immediate family in Israel. After finishing basic training, I was sent for 3 months to a combat medic course, and I completed most of my year and a half of service in the Army as a medic in a tank unit. On the first Saturday of June 1982, nearly 40 years ago, after playing in a softball game, I was relaxing in my room. There was a knock on the door, which I ignored. It was siesta time. By the third knock, my neighbor came in and told me they're here. I said, who's here? The Army. You need to sign this form. It was an emergency call-up of my reserve unit for duty, so I packed my bag and left the kibbutz. And after traveling all night to get to my unit's meeting place, by Sunday morning I was in Lebanon. At the same time that I was leaving the kibbutz, most of the men were being called up. The cotton fields and all the other agriculture would be left unattended. It was then that General Davidi, of blessed memory, Zichrono Livracha, realized that no farmers were left to tend to the crops. Thus, Sar El was born 40 years ago, when American volunteers came over to work the land while the war in Lebanon was raging. This was the first intersection of Sar El with my life. Sar El's finding was a turning point in the lives of over 160,000 people who have faithfully served as volunteers over the years. I think I heard 250, I'm not sure, 250,000, but 1982 was also a turning point in my life as I fought in a war in Lebanon, and that same year I met my wife. We got married a year later, and for the next few years I was still doing reserve duty in Lebanon, even having to serve soon after my first son was born. Fast forward 27 years. My wife and I had moved back to New Jersey, where my parents were living. Friends of ours from kibbutz Neve Or also lived nearby in New Jersey. They told me about the Volunteers for Israel and Sar El, so I volunteered for the first time in 2009. My wife and I have 3 children. One summer, our daughter, Anat, surprised us by announcing that she was leaving Rutgers University after only 1 year to join the Israeli army. She enlisted in 2012, also as a lone soldier. In 2012, I volunteered for Sar El for the second time. I was hoping to see my daughter. And sure enough, she got time off from her base to come to see me, to come see her Abba in uniform on my base. A year later, I again volunteered, knowing that my daughter was serving for 2 years. I asked to serve on a base somewhere in the north because her base was also in the north. And once again, she visited me on my base. Over the years, I became active in Volunteers for Israel, primarily doing interviews for potential volunteers and serving on the Volunteers for Israel board. My fourth volunteer stint was in 2018. When a volunteer arrives in Israel, you don't know where you're going to go, which base you're going to be sent to. To my surprise, I was assigned to my daughter's base, even though she had long since finished her Army service. When she called me from the States, I said to her, "Guess where I am? I'm on your base." I want to thank VFI and Sar El for all the wonderful opportunities they've given me to continue to support Israel. And if I could offer a toast, I would say Sar El at 40. Here's to another great 40 years, or better yet, Ad 120, until 120. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Litwack. I'm honored to invite volunteers Carol and Barry Stain to say a few words.
30 years ago, if anyone would have told me that I would go to Israel once, I would say, no way. It's nice, I care, I donate money, tzedakah, but it's not any place on my bucket list of places to visit. Next thing I know, I get a call at work. My mother calls and says, "Carol, I'm going back to Israel. It may be the last time, and I want you and Barry to come." And I'm ashamed to say my answer was no. I said, I have 3 daughters, I have a husband, I have a house, I have a busy job, and when I get 2 weeks vacation a year, I want to go someplace a little bit more lively, sexy, exotic, I don't know. That's what I thought. And I mentioned it to a couple friends, one in particular, and she said, "Car, you got to go. You don't know if you'll ever travel with your mother again." And then the guilt started, the Jewish guilt. Okay, and I thought about it some more. I said, "Oh, what the heck, I'll go." Nice of me, yes? And 30 years later, if you told me I'd be standing here talking about my 35 trips to Israel, I would say, no way, but that's what I'm doing. When I literally stepped out of the plane with my mother and my husband and her man friend, something happened to me, something funny. And I think I was ambushed by Israel. I had told people that I was going to flunk Israel, which is an expression we use when you take a course in school and you get an F. I was going to get an F in Israel. It wasn't going to get to me, but it did. And it's kind of a weird thing, but I haven't spent a day since not thinking, worrying, loving, feeling pride, something to do with Israel. So the first year after that trip, that tour, I was very depressed, and I kept nagging Barry, "We've got to go back, got to go back." But I don't want to be a tourist. I want to do something different. And I found an ad in a local paper for Volunteers for Israel. And I called, and I spoke to someone in New York where the office was, and he says, "Yes, you can volunteer on a base, but this year we're actually doing an archaeological dig at Bet Shan." And that sounded different, and I thought maybe he would come along because that was not just being on a base, but it was active. So we went, and for 3 weeks we dug at Bet Shan. We met amazing people. One person became a very close friend of mine. I don't think we ever laughed so much. One day we were digging, and we had a big tarpaulin in front of us because it was so hot. And the visitors would come down the hill, and they would stop at where we were digging, and they would pick up the tarp to see who was there. and they took pictures of us. They thought we were Israelis, and here they went and took pictures of us home. They never knew who we were, but we got to be famous in some other country just because they were there. The next year, I went back to Israel with my friend and 2 other women, which was probably, again, another time that was really special because women together laugh a lot and say things and do things that they don't do just with their husbands. And I was put on a base called Julis. And Julis, they had transportation vehicles, buses, jeeps, trucks, all those things. What was my job? First morning, I was told, go to Pluga Aleph. Where is that? I don't know. I found it. And go talk to someone named Avram. Okay. So I walked over, and I'm in this big area with buses and all kinds of things and activity. And I don't know Avram from anybody, so I asked somebody. I was told, he's there under the bus. Okay. So I go, and I stand by the bus. And I know there's some activity under the bus. I see somebody's feet, and I'm waiting and waiting and waiting. Nothing's happening. No one says hello, goodbye, go away, nothing. So I finally bend down, and I say, excuse me, are you Avram? And a man comes out, and he says, now I know you're serious. Go over there, there's a dolly. Go bring it over here, lie down on the dolly, and come under the bus with me. We're going to solder a tailpipe. Okay. I'd never done anything like that. And 5 minutes later, that's what I was doing. I was helping to solder a tailpipe. I learned that Israelis like to make use of things over and over, so they took a piece of tailpipe from a different machine, a different vehicle, and they were soldering onto this one, and it was going to be fine. Again, an experience I never, ever dreamed of. Another time I went back, and I was sorting bullets on a conveyor belt. It was almost like Lucy and Ethel, the conveyor belt. The bullets are coming, and they're coming, and I'm saying, yes, this is good, no, this is not. And I'm thinking, it's such a responsible job to decide if this bullet is going to work or not. Well, the women will appreciate this. I was getting hot flashes the whole time I was there. It was hot, and I was a mess. And I said something, and the next thing I know, one of the soldiers brings out a huge fan, a floor fan, about this big, and they pointed toward me, and the rest of the afternoon, I was very comfortable. And that's, again, a little Israeli hospitality, I guess. Another time I went by myself, and I was on a base, and I met a young man who was my madrich named Ori. And Ori was very friendly, and I enjoyed his company. And one evening, he said, you know what, Carol, come with me. I want you to meet my parents. I said, are we allowed to leave the base? He said, it's okay. So next thing I know, I'm in a car, and he's playing music by Noah. I never heard Noah sing before. And she's singing Boi Chala. I love the music. And the next thing, we're at his parents' kibbutz Inat. And they're lovely people, and they're happy to see me. And I'm thinking, this is really special. I made an impression on this madrich. So he came home, and that was that. I stayed in touch with him, and he is now a friend of our family. We saw him through his wedding and his 3 children and all the things they've done. But one night I said to him, Ori, what would have happened if I said, no, I didn't want to go on that ride with you? He said, I would have asked some other woman. Okay. Ever since I went to Israel, I made it my mission, and I don't have too many missions, to get as many people to come to see Israel as possible. And I think I've tried to pretty much fill that mission. A lot of friends and different people who never, ever would have thought of coming here to see what this land is like, Israel is like, have gone. I feel when I'm in Israel, I am home. And it's an expression a lot of people say, I'm home. But when I'm in Israel, I am the most me that I am. And that's a gift. And it's not your typical Israeli story, maybe, but I'm very grateful to Israel for being there when I got there, for being there now, and God willing, forever. Thank you.
And some of the other speakers have spoken about the unique personal experiences and moving experiences. And Karen and I also have the sense that if you go to Israel as a tourist, as most Americans do, you don't really see Israel. And the Sar El experience really, we see Israel as Israel is, and Israelis as Israelis are. It's really important for the people in the United States to understand this, because I don't think we have an appreciation of that. I'd like to speak just a couple moments about two major things that I think are really important relative to Sar El and relative to Volunteers for Israel. One is, we were at Matrop, as many other people were. Logistics-based, tremendous amount of work to do. And we understood that it was important to again, because Israel's not like the United States, not a throwaway, at least it has not been a throwaway society. You want to reuse things that you can reuse. And so we did. But the important thing here was the volume of work that was given to the base. And we interviewed our group commander about this just before we were left. And we said, give us a sense of what reality is. He said, oh, well, we get 25% more work than we can do, 30% more work than we can do. If it were not for you volunteers, and many of the people here are volunteers, I wouldn't see my family very much. So the sense of what you can contribute is really significant, because this isn't our impression of what we did, because we feel good about that, but the reality of it, that the importance of it to the IDF. The second thing was that the connection with the real Israel. Again, we were at Palmachim, the air base, and Carol and I made a special effort to meet the soldiers, because volunteers don't do this. You know, the Israeli soldiers speak Hebrew. Unless you speak Hebrew, you find that volunteers sit at one table and the soldiers sit at another table. So we said, okay, we're going to sit down, make an effort to do this, meet the soldiers. So we sit down, and Carol knows a bit of Hebrew, and my Hebrew is very weak. And it turned out that, of course, there's one soldier who speaks some Hebrew, and then we have a conversation, a long conversation. And they said to us, we have to be here. You don't. Why do you come? Why do you leave your United States, all the amenities in the United States? You come to a base, you live, if it's husband and wife, you live separate, you work hard, and you pay for it. They think we're absolutely Michigan. And as one of the people said early in the game, we're positive Michiganders. You know, we come because it's gratifying to us, but also we know and understand why we're there and what our contribution is. And it allows us not to better understand Israel, but also to become better spokespeople in the United States. We all in the United States, we know there's a lot of negative information that comes out from Israel. But we are there. We can speak to people as being there. We're not Israelis, but we can speak to people with a perspective that you don't have if you haven't served in a volunteer capacity. So we're pleased to be the opportunity to speak with you, and pleased to have done the work and anticipate going back in the future, even at our age, by the way. And I don't want to say this, we're octogenarians, okay? So we're not kids, but we have enough energy and excitement to do it.
Sar El, I think that it is like a love story, okay? And like everything in love, we are feeling familiar. And when I see you, my heart is very, very full of love for you, dear volunteer. And when we are working with love and from the spirit of loving Israel and loving you and loving the soldier, I think that everything can only work well. We had the chance in the last few months, in the last year, to find friends that share the same love for us, to this country and to the soldier. And I want also to tell thank you to the friends that we met Okay, this is Tzachi. We have Adi Werner, who is the CEO of Olam Shalem, an organization that is in partnership with us on this delegation. She will be coming and saying a few words, but before that, I want also to say a very big thank you to Mike Ribka. He was sponsoring this evening, and it is thanks for him that we are here. So thank you. Your love to Israel and to Sar El and to the soldier, we can learn all of it. Thank you very much, Mike. Adi, toda rabba.
If you will, it is no legend. And if you do not will it, all I've told you is a legend, and the legend it will continue to be. Binyamin Zev Herzl. Some people dare to dream to come to Eretz Israel and fulfill the dream of volunteering in the IDF more than 25 times. To present certificates of appreciations and a small gift to them, I am honored to invite Chief Logistics Officer Brigadier General Ronen Cohen, Chairman of the World Zionist Organization and Acting Chairman of the Jewish Agency, Mr. Yaakov Chavguel, Sar El CEO Keren Da'an, Commander of the Volunteers Unit, Sar El Einav Leket, and Mr. Eddie Kuckerman, member of the Sar El Board. Sarah Hornfeld. Sarah Hornfeld is a Holocaust survivor from Romania. In 1947, her ship of Holocaust survivors heading to Palestine was captured by the British, and Sarah was imprisoned in Cyprus. She eventually moved to Israel and served as an officer in the 1956 Suez War. And although she now lives in New York, she never lost her connection to Israel, and to maintain that, she became a Sar El volunteer. Sarah tells her children, "My body is an American, but my heart will always be in Israel." Sarah, you're welcome to come here to take. Richard Bernstein has compiled a list of 13 volunteers over the age of 80 who have been on Sar El multiple times in the last 10 years. You're welcome to come. Edward Pollan, Rose Schussel, Lawrence Solomon, Carol and Barry Stain, Elliot Seton, Gerald Marcus, Jacob Rosenbaum, Renee Burekas, Jerry Kaplan, Rachel Solomon, Toby Levy, and Mike Ripka are all welcome to come upstairs.
What's your name?
Carol.
Is that Richard over there?
Thank you all for coming, and we are looking forward to see you all in the base in Israel and to do Aliyah and to join the army and to come to live in the country. Toda rabba.
Richard.